Solving quadratic equations by factoring. You have solved quadratic equations by factoring before, but there's going to be another method that you're going to use today, and that's called the zero product property. And if you look at the chart here, I do want you writing this chart out. And what you're doing is you are getting your function, you're solving for the variables and getting them equal to 0. So it says if the product of two quantities equals 0, at least one of the quantities is going to equal 0. So here you might be given numbers, and for your variable you could plug in 0 for the variable. So 3 times 0 is going to equal 0. Or you could do 0 times 4 equals 0. So if AB equals 0, then A equals 0, or B is going to equal 0. That might be a little confusing. I'm going to show you some examples where you have a function and you're solving for your variable to find out what the numbers could be. So let's get into the zero product property and work through some of this so it makes sense. Here we have x, then x plus 4 equals 0. What you first want to do is you want to look at each separate situation here. You have x, you set that equal to 0. Then you have x plus 4, and you set that equal to 0. And what you do is you solve for x. Well, x equals 0, that's just done. For the second one here, you can subtract 4 to each side, so x equals negative 4. So the solutions to this first problem here, A, is going to be 0 and negative 4. And how can we check that? You're going to substitute those values into the original. So if one of the solutions is 0, we substitute 0 back into the original. So 0, parentheses 0 plus 4. 0 plus 4 is 4. 0 times 4 is 0. 0 equals 0, so that works. Now we're going to substitute negative 4 into the solution. So x, we're going to get negative 4. X plus 4, negative 4 plus 4, negative 4 times 0 is 0. So this checks out because we're getting 0 when we're substituting our solutions into the original. Whoops. Looking at B, we have x plus 4, x minus 3. So we're going to set each separate situation equal to 0 to solve for x. So for x plus 4, you subtract 4 to each side to get x equals negative 4. The second one, we're going to add 3 to each side to get x equals 3. So the solutions here are going to be negative 4 and 3. Again, to check it, we would substitute negative 4 into the original to see that they equal 0. Again, we'll substitute 3 into the original to see that we get 0 on each side as well. Next situation we have here, solve the equation by factoring. And then we're going to check our answer. So notice here we haven't factored anything out. We have our quadratic function. So we first need to factor out here our x squared minus 6x plus 9. That's going to factor to be x minus 3 and x minus 3. So we set this x minus 3 equal to 0. We solve for x by adding 3 to each side. So if we add 3 to each side, x is going to equal 3. So that's going to be our solution, x equals 3. So to check our work, before we check our work, I do want to mention both equations result in the same solution. So therefore, since they're both equal to 3, there's going to be one solution, and that's going to equal 3 right there. Now to check, we substitute 3 into the original equation. And by substituting 3 in for x, 3 squared is 9. Minus 6 times 3 plus 9, that's going to give you 0 on the left, equals 0 on the right, and it checks itself out right there. For B, we need to rewrite this in the standard form, x squared plus bx plus c. So we need to subtract 5 to each side. So what we get now is we would get, let me rewrite this over here, we would get x squared plus 4x minus 5. Now for this particular graph, they just graphed it using a graphing calculator. You can factor out if you want to. Here it says graph the quadratic function. The zeros of the related function would be the same for factoring. So when we graph this, notice we have two zeros. one that falls at the value -5, and one that falls at the value 1. So this particular question has two solutions, which means it has two zeros, the value 1 and -5. And so that's another way to graph this, solving the equation by factoring. Example 3, it says solve each quadratic equation by factoring here. So here we have 3x squared minus 4x plus 1 equals 0. So what we need to do is see if we can factor anything out. We can't, but we can break this down into 3x minus 1, x minus 1. So then we set each, we set each situation equal to 0. 3x minus 1 equals 0. X minus 1 equals 0, and we solve for x. Here we could add 1 to each side to get 3x equals 1. Here we add 1 to each side, so x equals 1. Divide the 3 here on each side, so x should equal 1/3. X equals 1. So this here will have two solutions. X equals 1/3 and x equals 1. So let's walk through the rest of this to check our solution. So there we have x equals 1/3, x equals 1. Two solutions. To check our work, we just substitute back in. So 3 times 1/3 squared minus 4 times 1/3 plus 1, that's going to equal 0. So 0 equals 0. 3 times 1 squared minus 4 times 1 plus 1 equals 0. 0 equals 0. So it checks itself out. In this section, you might also see a story problem. It says here the height above the water for another diver can be modeled by h equals -16t squared plus 8t plus 24. And so they want to find the time it takes the diver to reach the water. So what we first have to do is we need to factor out the situation. -8 goes into each of these. So we factor out an 8 to get 2t squared minus t minus 3. And so then we're going to factor this trinomial here to get 2t minus 3, t plus 1. Don't forget about that -8 in front of the parentheses. We set each of these equal to 0. -8 does not equal 0, so you do have to set that value outside the parentheses equal to 0, which it will not equal 0. 2t minus 3 equals 0. You would add 3 to each side, then divide 2. So you get 3 divided by 2, which is t equals 1.5. The next one here we have t plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1 to each side. They can't have a negative time because they want to find the time it takes. They can't have a negative. So the actual time it's going to take the diver to reach the water is going to be 1.5 seconds. So when you're solving getting the zeros, you have to think about time and what's realistic. A realistic situation when you're finding the zeros to get your time here.